The air in Mr. Abernathy's law office was thick with the scent of old paper and stale pipe tobacco, a smell that clung to the dark wood panelling and the leather-bound books that had never been read. It was the smell of finality. I sat on a stiff-backed chair, my work-calloused hands resting awkwardly on my knees, the fabric of my only suit feeling foreign and tight across my shoulders. Across the polished mahogany desk, my cousin, David Sterling, shifted impatiently. He looked more at home in a suit than I did, his tie perfectly knotted, his ambition barely concealed behind a mask of feigned grief. My father, Daniel Miller, had been buried 2 days prior, a simple service for a simple man who had loved 2 things above all else, his family and his 320 acres of black Iowa soil. He'd worked that land his entire life, and it had worked him right back, carving deep lines into his face and stooping his powerful shoulders. Now, all that was left of him was a plot on a hill overlooking his fields, and this last piece of business in town. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound like gravel rattling in a tin can. He adjusted his spectacles and read from the document in a dry monotone. "To my sister, Eleanor Sterling," he read, nodding toward Dave's mother, who sat beside him. "I bequeath a sum of $150,000, representing a fair market value for half of the estate's liquid assets and land equity." Dave's eyes lit up. He shot a quick, triumphant glance at his mother. That was a fortune in 1973. It was more cash than most farmers saw in a decade. Abernathy continued, his voice unwavering. "And to my son, Thomas Miller, I bequeath the Miller Home Farm, comprising 320 acres, Section 17, Township 84 North, Range 31, west of the 5th Principal Meridian, along with the homestead, all outbuildings, and all associated farm machinery and equipment. Said property is to be conveyed free of all liens and encumbrances." The words hung in the air. Free and clear, paid for. My father had done it. Through the lean years of the 50s and the better years of the 60s, he had scraped and saved and sacrificed until the farm was truly his. A wave of gratitude so profound it almost buckled me washed over. I looked down at my hands, the same hands he'd taught to grip a wrench, to judge the moisture of a handful of soil, to steer a straight furrow. Dave broke the silence. "Well, that's that, I suppose," he said, a little too cheerfully. He stood and shook Mr. Abernathy's hand. "We appreciate your time." Outside, on the sun-drenched sidewalk of Main Street, the mask of civility dropped. Dave clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was more of a shove than a comfort. "Sorry about your dad, Tom. He was a good man, a hard worker." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "But a little behind the times, you know." I didn't say anything. I just watched as the farmers who had been at the funeral drove past in their pickups, nodding grimly in my direction. "Look," Dave went on, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Mum and I, we're buying the old Henderson place, the 480 acres bordering you to the west, using Dad's money for the down payment, the banks falling all over themselves to lend us the rest. Land prices are only going one way, Tom. Up." He gestured back toward the farm, toward my inheritance. "You're sitting on a gold mine, but you can't dig it out with that junk he left you. A 68-40-20? A Farmel M that belongs in a museum? That old Gleaner E? Tom, it's the 70s. You got to get big or get out. Earl Butts himself said so." I finally found my voice. "That junk paid for this farm, Dave. It put food on our table. It never failed him." Dave laughed, a short, sharp bark that turned heads on the sidewalk. It never failed him because he never asked it to do anything. Farming 300 acres? That's a hobby farm these days. I'm going to be running over 1,000 acres by next year. I just put an order in for a new international philosophies 6, turbocharged diesel, 145 horsepower at the PTO. Comes with a cab, air conditioning, even a radio. While you're out there sweating and choking on dust in that old John Deere, I'll be sitting in comfort, farming circles around you. He wasn't just confident, he was arrogant. He saw my father's legacy not as a foundation of freedom, but as a prison of mediocrity. He saw the paid-off land and the old iron as a sign of my father's lack of vision, and by extension, my own. "Debt is a tool, Tom," he said, tapping his temple as if sharing a profound secret. "You use the bank's money to make more money. It's the only way to get ahead." I just shook my head. Dad always said, "The banker is your partner until the first dry year. Then he's your boss." Dave's smile tightened. "That's old man thinking. This is a new era. We're feeding the world now. The Russians are buying our grain. Prices are going to go to the moon." He clapped my shoulder again, harder this time. "You do what you want with your museum pieces. I've got a future to build." He and his mother walked away, leaving me standing there in my ill-fitting suit, the weight of my father's legacy feeling heavier than ever. It wasn't just a farm he'd left me. It was a philosophy, a way of life that was being mocked as obsolete before he was even cold in the ground. I looked down the road, toward the flat, dark horizon that held my future. Dave had his new iron and his mountain of debt. I had my father's paid-for fields and his collection of aging, greasy, beautiful machines, and the whole county was watching to see which one of us would break first. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had to choose between the old, proven way and the new, flashy way? Maybe it was a tool, a job, or just a piece of advice. Let me know in the comments below, because I was facing that choice right then, with the smell of my dad's old spice still faint in the collar of his church coat, and I had no idea the storm that was coming. That first spring was a trial by fire, or more accurately, by mud and oil. The winter had been long and wet, and the ground was saturated. It was the kind of spring that tests a man's patience and his equipment's resolve. Dave was out in his fields the first week of April. I could see him from my own fence row, a tiny red speck moving across the vast expanse of the old Henderson farm. His new International 14 pulling a 24-foot disc, looked like a machine from the future. It moved with an implacable, arrogant speed, its dual rear wheels churning through the damp soil, the enclosed cab a silent bubble of modern comfort. Meanwhile, I was in my machine shed, a place that smelled of diesel, grease, and 30 years of hard labor. My workhorse, the John Deere 4020, sat in the center of the concrete floor under the bare light bulb, its lifeblood dripping onto a flattened cardboard box. A slow, steady drip of hydraulic fluid from somewhere deep in its guts. It was a problem that had been getting worse over the winter, and I could no longer ignore it. My father's service manuals, their pages soft as cloth and stained with the ghosts of greasy fingerprints, were spread out on the workbench. I traced the diagrams with a dirty finger, narrowing the problem down to the rock shaft housing. The O-rings and seals within were likely shot after thousands of hours of lifting heavy implements. It was a job Dad had done once before, back when I was a boy. I remembered holding the trouble light for him, fascinated by the intricate maze of valves and pistons he'd revealed. Now it was my turn. The first step was draining the 20-some gallons of high guard fluid, a costly but necessary sacrifice. Then came the real work, wrestling with the 3-point hitch arms, knocking the pins free with a 3-pound sledgehammer and a brass drift. The sound echoed in the quiet shed, a lonely percussion of metal on metal. I unbolted the heavy cast-iron housing, all 100+ pounds of it. Using a chain hoist my dad had rigged to a barn beam, I carefully lifted it free and swung it onto the workbench. Inside, it was just as I remembered, a complex world of precision-machined steel. And just as I'd suspected, the main O-rings were flattened and brittle, cracked with age. A trip to the John Deere dealership in town confirmed it. The parts man, a grizzled old-timer named Gus, slid the new seals across the counter. "Rock shaft housing on a 40-20, huh?" he said, a glint in his eye. "Your daddy's boy, all right. He knew these things inside and out." He leaned in closer. "Saw your cousin Dave in here yesterday, writing a check for a new planter that cost more than my first house. Said he had his corn in the ground already." The words were a subtle jab, a reminder of my slow start. "I'll get there," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "I know you will, son," Gus said, his tone softening. "Your dad built that place to last, not to be flashy." Back in the shed, the reassembly was a meticulous, frustrating dance, cleaning every part in the solvent tank until it gleamed, carefully seating the new O-rings, coating them in fresh hydraulic fluid so they wouldn't tear on installation, using the hoist to lower the housing back into place, nudging it fractions of an inch at a time until the bolt holes aligned perfectly. It took me 3 days, 3 long, greasy, back-breaking days. While I was turning wrenches, Dave's 1466 was roaring across the landscape, its disc followed by the massive new planter, putting seed in the ground at a rate I could only dream of. The talk at the co-op was merciless. I'd gone in for a few bags of seed corn, and the morning coffee crew was in full session around the pot-bellied stove, even though it was spring. "See, Tom's finally getting out of the shop," one of them, a farmer named Bill Peterson, said loud enough for me to hear. "Dave's about done planting corn already, moving on to beans." Another chimed in. "Heard that new rig of his has an 8-track player. Can you imagine? Farming and listening to Johnny Cash in an air-conditioned cab." They looked at me with a mixture of pity and something that felt like scorn. I was a relic, a ghost of a bygone era. I was my father's son, all right. Cautious, slow, unwilling to take the risks necessary to succeed in this new, supercharged world of agriculture. I just paid for my seed, nodded at the men, and walked out, their laughter following me into the parking lot. When I finally got the 40-20 buttoned up and filled with fresh fluid, the moment of truth arrived. I climbed into the familiar worn seat, the vinyl cracked and weathered like an old map. I turned the key. The 6-cylinder diesel engine spun to life with its distinctive, throaty roar. I moved the rock shaft lever, and the 3-point hitch arms rose smoothly, powerfully, without a single shudder or leak. A small, quiet smile touched my lips. It was a victory no one else would see or appreciate, but it was mine. Out in the field, the wet ground was still a problem. The 4-20, pulling my old 6-row planter, handled it well enough, its weight distributed evenly. But in the low spots, the clay soil was slick as grease. I got stuck twice, having to unhitch the planter and carefully work the tractor free. Each time cost me hours. One afternoon, I saw a commotion over on Dave's land. His giant 1466 was buried up to its axles in a wet spot, its big duals spinning uselessly, flinging mud 20 feet in the air. His new, heavy equipment, which was so efficient on good ground, had become his anchor in the bad. He'd had to call the wrecker service from town, and the cost of that, I knew, was not trivial. I finished my own wettest spots last, not with the big 40-20, but with my father's old Farmall M. It was small, nimble, and light on its feet. It sipped gasoline instead of gulping diesel, and it could tiptoe through the mud that had swallowed Dave's modern beast. It was slow, tedious work, planting 2 rows at a time, but it got the job done. By the end of May, all my seed was in the ground. I was 2 weeks behind Dave, but my fields were planted, corner to corner. I had done it my way, with my father's machines, and for the first time since he'd passed, the heavy weight on my shoulders felt a little less like a burden and a little more like a mantle. The next few years were a blur of hard work and high prices. The world, it seemed, had an insatiable appetite for American grain. The Russian grain deal of '72 had kicked things off, and the momentum never slowed. Corn prices, which had hovered around $1.50 a bushel for most of my life, surged past $2, then $2.50, then kissed $3. Soybeans were on a similar rocket ride. It was the golden age. Every farm magazine, every university extension agent, every banker was preaching the same gospel: expand, borrow, leverage your assets, plant fence row to fence row. Food is a weapon in the Cold War, and you, the American farmer, are the soldier on the front lines. No one embraced this gospel more fervently than my cousin Dave. He was the poster child for the new era of farming. The profits from those first few years were astounding, but for Dave, they weren't something to be saved. They were fuel for the fire of his ambition. He used his ever-increasing paper equity in the Henderson place as collateral to buy more. He bought the 80 acres to his north at a public auction, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers in the crowd gasp and shake their heads. The next year, he leased another 600 acres from a widow who'd moved to Florida. His line of equipment grew with his acreage. The 1466, not even 3 years old, was traded in for a brand-new International 1586, an even bigger, more powerful machine. A second, equally massive John Deere tractor appeared in his machine shed. He bought a new Gleaner N6 combine, a rotary machine that could chew through 8 rows of corn at a time, making my old 6-row conventional Gleaner E look like a child's toy. His farmstead transformed. The old Henderson farmhouse was bulldozed, and in its place rose a sprawling new brick ranch-style house with a 2-car garage and a paved driveway. He was no longer just farming. He was building an empire on a foundation of borrowed money. At family gatherings, he was unbearable. He'd corner me by the potato salad, smelling of expensive aftershave, and talk loudly about depreciation schedules and his new tax write-offs. "You see, Tom," he'd say, waving a beer bottle for emphasis. "This new equipment, it pays for itself. You can write off the interest on the loans, depreciate the machinery. It's a fool's game to be running old paid-for junk. You're leaving money on the table. You're paying more in taxes than I am, and I'm farming 4 times the ground." He called me Old Man Miller II, a nickname that spread through the county. It wasn't meant as a compliment. It painted me as a man stuck in the past, too timid to seize the incredible opportunity laid before us. A man content to just get by while fortunes were being made. And from the outside, they were right. I was making good money, better money than my father ever had. My yields were solid, and the prices were a gift. But I remembered his words. I remembered the stories of the Great Depression, of neighbors who lost everything because they'd overextended in the good times of the 1920s. So I didn't expand. I didn't borrow. My operating loan for seed and fertilizer was paid off in full the day I sold my first load of grain each fall. The rest of the money went into 2 places: a savings account at the local bank and back into my own farm. I didn't buy new machines, but I made my old ones better than new. I spent one long winter in the shop completely overhauling the engine in the 40s-20. I pulled the block, had the cylinders bored, and installed new pistons, sleeves, and bearings. I sent the injector pump and nozzles out to be professionally rebuilt. When I put it all back together and fired it up, it ran smoother and stronger than it had in 20 years. Another winter was dedicated to the old Gleaner E. I replaced every bearing, every belt, and every chain. I welded patches onto the sheet metal and gave it a fresh coat of paint. To my neighbors, it looked like I was polishing relics. They saw me covered in grease, spending my winters with a wrench in my hand, while Dave was in Florida on vacation. They saw my discipline as fear. They saw my frugality as a lack of vision. I was falling behind, a living example of what happened when you didn't get big. The only person who seemed to understand was Mr. Harris, the old, cautious president of the Farmers and Merchants Bank. He was a man from my father's generation, a man who wore suspenders and had seen a boom and a bust or two in his day. Each December, I'd go into his office to make the final payment on my operating note for the year. This particular year, 1978, was no different. I slid the check across his desk. He looked at it, then up at me over his bifocals. "You know, Tom," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you're the only one." "The only one what, Mr. Harris?" "The only farmer on my books who will end the year with a zero balance. The only one who isn't borrowing against these inflated land values. Everyone else, your cousin included, they're borrowing more every year, using next year's expected profits to buy more land, more equipment today. It's a house of cards, and the wind is starting to pick up." As I left his office, feeling the quiet satisfaction of being debt-free, the glass door opened and Dave strode in. He was laughing, clapping a young loan officer on the back. He was tanned from a recent trip, radiating success. He nodded curtly at me, a dismissive gesture from a king to a peasant. He was headed, no doubt, to sign the papers for another farm, another loan, another brick in his teetering empire. I climbed into my old Ford pickup, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. I turned the knob on the AM radio. A newscaster's serious voice filled the cab. He was talking about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. He was talking about a war on inflation, about a monetary policy that would be painful but necessary. He used a phrase I'd never heard before. Double-digit interest rates. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was the feeling a man gets when he's standing on a clear, sunny day and sees a dark, unnatural line of clouds massing on the far horizon. The party had been raging for years, and the music was loud. But I could hear, faintly at first, the sound of it beginning to stop. And I knew that when it did, there wouldn't be enough chairs for everyone. The first sign of trouble came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper on the wind. It was the summer of 1980, and the wind had been blowing hot and relentless from the south for 6 weeks. The sky, once a brilliant Iowa blue, had taken on a hazy, bleached-out quality. The corn, which should have been tasseling in a sea of deep green, was curled tight, its leaves a sickly, greyish colour, trying desperately to hold on to what little moisture remained. The rain simply stopped. Ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. Creeks dwindled to a trickle over mossy stones. My father had seen droughts before. "You watch the deep-rooted weeds," he'd told me once, pointing with a calloused finger at a stubborn thistle. "When they start to wilt, you know you're in real trouble." By mid-July, the thistles were wilting. My old equipment, designed for a different era, seemed to understand the need for conservation, The 4020, pulling a cultivator through the dusty rows, sipped diesel at a rate that was manageable. Its open station, while hot, allowed me to feel the heat, to smell the parched earth, to be connected to the crisis in a way a man in an air-conditioned cab never could be. Every evening, I'd shut it down and check the fluids, clean the air filter, and walk the fields, my boots kicking up clouds of fine, powder-like soil. I was worried, but my costs were low. My land and machinery were paid for. I could weather a bad year. Dave could not. His operation was built for maximum yield, maximum efficiency, and maximum cash flow. It was a finely tuned engine that required a constant, massive infusion of fuel in the form of rain and credit. With the rain gone, the credit was all he had left. His huge four-wheel drive tractors, pulling 30-foot field cultivators, burned through diesel at a shocking rate. The cost of fuel, already high from the energy crisis, was a constant hemorrhage of cash. I'd see his center pivot irrigation systems running in the distance, giant mechanical arms spraying precious water into the hot, dry air. It was a valiant, expensive effort to fight the inevitable. But much of the water simply evaporated before it ever hit the ground. It was like trying to put out a house fire with a teacup. Then came the second blow. In January, President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. At the time, it felt distant, a thing on the news that happened in Washington. But by late summer, the reality crashed into our local grain elevator. The primary export market for our corn vanished overnight. Prices, which had been the foundation of Dave's empire of debt, began to slide. Then they tumbled, then they fell off a cliff. The talk at the co-op was no longer about new tractors or Florida vacations. It was quiet, grim, and laced with fear. Men who had been farming for 40 years looked haunted. The coffee pot sat half empty. The breaking point for Dave came during the soybean harvest in late September. The drought had stunted the beans, leaving them short and brittle. The pods were dry and prone to shattering, sending the precious crop onto the ground before it ever made it into the combine. It was a slow, frustrating harvest that demanded patience and a delicate touch. I was out on my old Gleaner E, running it as slow as the engine would allow, the header skimming just above the ground. It was tedious, but I was getting most of what was there. One afternoon, I saw Dave's massive Gleaner N6 stop dead in the middle of his field. It was a monstrously complex machine, a marvel of engineering, but its complexity was its Achilles' heel. I watched through my binoculars as Dave and a hired hand frantically worked on the side of it, tools scattered on the ground. The next day, it was still sitting there. Gus, the parts man at the dealership, told me what happened. "Hydrostatic transmission pump went out," he said, shaking his head as he wiped his hands on a rag. "Special order part. Have to get it from the factory in Independence. Gonna be 3 days minimum. And the part alone costs more than your daddy paid for that whole Gleaner of yours." 3 days of downtime during a critical harvest window was a disaster. But for Dave, it was worse. The N6 wasn't just a combine. It was a payment. A massive, relentless payment that didn't care if it was sitting broken in a field. While it sat, his beans were shattering. His debt was accruing interest at a terrifying new rate, 18, then 19, then 20%. And the bank was calling. The young, friendly loan officer had been replaced by a humorless man from the corporate office in Des Moines. A man who only spoke in terms of collateral and liquidation values. The cracks in Dave's empire were no longer just showing. They were becoming chasms. One evening, I saw the lights on, late in his machine shed. I walked over, crossing the dry ditch that separated our properties. The big metal door was open, casting a pale yellow rectangle of light onto the yard. Dave was standing over the engine of his 1586, a wrench in his hand, his face streaked with grease and something that looked like despair. He didn't look like the king of the county anymore. He just looked tired, beaten. "Injector trouble," he mumbled, not looking at me. "Number 4 cylinder is missing." He threw the wrench onto the concrete floor, where it clattered with a sound of pure frustration. Another $1,000 fix. It never ends, Tom. It's like these things were designed to break. Every time I turn around, it's another part, another bill, another problem I don't have the cash to solve. He finally looked at me, his eyes hollow. The banker called again today. He said land values are down 30% from last year. 30%. My equity. It's gone. Wiped out. I'm farming over 2,000 acres and I'm broke. How the hell does that happen? I didn't have an answer for him. I just stood there in the silence of the cavernous shed, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of red and green iron that had become his prison. The wind picked up outside, blowing dust and dry leaves across the yard. It was the sound of an era ending. The winter of 1981 was bleak. The snow came, covering the ravaged fields in a blanket of white, but it couldn't cover the fear. Farm auctions started appearing in the newspaper classifieds, first a trickle, then a flood. Neighbors you'd known your whole life were selling out, their life's work spread across the frozen lawn for strangers to pick over. The prices were heartbreaking. A tractor that cost $80,000 2 years ago was selling for $30,000. The bankers were there, grim-faced men in overcoats, taking notes on clipboards, calculating their losses. Dave held on through that winter, a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. He tried to renegotiate his loans, but the bank wasn't interested. They had seen the numbers. They knew what he was just beginning to accept. He was insolvent. The machine he had built, fueled by debt and ambition, had consumed him. The foreclosure notice was nailed to his front door in March. It was a stark, official document that felt more violent than a punch to the gut. His auction was set for the second Saturday in April. It was the final, public dismantling of a dream. I survived. The drought had cut my yields in half, but my savings saw me through. I didn't make much money, but I didn't lose any either. My operating note for the year was small, and I paid it off with the grain I'd managed to harvest, while the financial world was imploding around me. My small, debt-free island remained stable. I spent the winter in my shop, just as I always had. I took the transmission out of the old Farmall M and replaced the seals and a worn bearing. It was a $200 job that I did myself. It was quiet work, methodical work. Each turn of the wrench was an affirmation of my father's wisdom. Self-sufficiency wasn't just a virtue. It was a survival strategy. One afternoon, a week before his sale, Dave's pickup truck pulled into my yard. He got out slowly, a man who had aged 10 years in 6 months. His shoulders were slumped, the arrogance replaced by a brittle, hollowed-out shame. "Tom," he said, his voice raspy, "I need to ask you something." I waited. "The bank is taking everything. The land, the house, the big equipment. But they said I could keep my personal tools if I can get them off the property." He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a patch of gravel near my feet. "I sold my truck to pay the light bill. I've got no way to move them." My father's voice echoed in my head, a quiet but insistent memory from my childhood. We'd been fixing a fence, and he saw a neighbor struggling. "You always help a neighbor, son," he had said, putting down his tools. "Doesn't matter if you like him or not. Doesn't matter if he's a fool. You help him because that's what decent people do." "I'll get my trailer," I said. "We can load them up." We spent the rest of the day in his magnificent, cathedral-like machine shed, which now felt like a tomb. We loaded his toolboxes, his welder, his air compressor, the instruments of a farmer's life, onto my flatbed trailer. We worked mostly in silence. The things he had once lauded over me, his success, his vision, his modern approach, were all gone. All that was left were two cousins, a shared history, and the quiet, heavy work of packing up a shattered life. When we were done, he leaned against the fender of my truck, his face pale in the fading light. "I was so sure I was right, Tom," he said, his voice cracking. "I looked at you, at your dad's old ways, and I saw failure. I saw a lack of courage. I thought you were a fool." He shook his head slowly. "Turns out, I was the fool all along. I built a house on sand, and the first big wave just washed it all away." I didn't say, "I told you so." There was no victory in his defeat, no satisfaction in his ruin. It was a tragedy that was playing out on farms all across the country. I just nodded. "Where do you want me to take this stuff, Dave?" "My wife's parents' place," he said quietly. "We're moving into their basement." The king was moving into a basement. The crisis had taken everything from him, including his pride. As I drove away, his worldly possessions rattling on the trailer behind me, I felt a profound sense of sorrow. My father's philosophy had been vindicated, but the cost of that lesson was devastatingly high. The day of Dave's auction was cold and grey, with a raw wind that whipped across the barren fields. It felt like the whole county was there, but it wasn't a festive, neighbourly crowd. They were like mourners at a wake, their faces grim, their voices low and hushed. They walked through the lines of machinery, kicking tires and looking under hoods, not with the excitement of potential buyers, but with the morbid curiosity of soldiers surveying a battlefield. Many of them knew their own auction could be next. The equipment was lined up on the pristine lawn in front of the new brick house Dave had been so proud of. The giant 1586, the four-wheel drive Steiger, the Gleaner N6 combine with its massive grain head resting on a transport trailer. They were monuments to a failed dream, behemoths of steel and debt. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, started his rhythmic chant, his voice amplified by a portable speaker system. The bidding was slow, almost painful. The prices were catastrophic. Men who had borrowed and scraped to buy this same equipment knew just a few years earlier were now watching it sell for pennies on the dollar. The banker stood off to the side, his face an impassive mask, but his pen never stopped moving, tallying the ever-growing mountain of loss. Dave and his family were nowhere to be seen. I couldn't blame them. To watch your life's work, your identity, sold off to the lowest bidder was a humiliation I wouldn't wish on anyone. I stood at the back of the crowd, a silent observer for most of the morning. I had no interest in his big, complicated machines. But then the auctioneer moved to the land. They were selling it in parcels. First, the 80 acres to the north. Then the 600 acres he had leased were simply terminated. Finally, they came to the original Henderson place, the 480 acres that bordered my farm, the parcel that had been the cornerstone of his entire empire. "All right, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing in the cold air. "Here it is, the home quarter, and then some. 480 acres of some of the best black dirt in this county. Who'll start the bidding for me?" Silence. The crowd shifted uneasily. Land that had been valued at over $3,000 an acre just a couple of years ago was now a terrifying liability. The opening bid was $1,000 an acre, a number that would have been laughable in 1978. Now, no one moved. The auctioneer tried again, his voice strained. $1,000 an acre, folks. You can't go wrong with good land. They ain't making any more of it." More silence. I thought of my father. I thought of his 30 years of scrimping and saving to pay off our 320 acres. I thought of the freedom that came with owning your land outright. And I thought of the money in my savings account, the profits from the good years that I hadn't squandered. It was earning a modest interest, safe and secure. It was a war chest my father's discipline had helped me build. I took a deep breath. The air was cold and sharp in my lungs. I raised my hand. 800, I said, my voice clear and steady. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Heads turned. People stared at me, at Old Man Miller II, the man who never took a risk, who never borrowed a dime. The banker's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. The auctioneer's face lit up. "I've got $800 an acre. Now who'll give me $850? Another farmer, a man I knew was also in good financial shape, bid $850. We went back and forth, the bids climbing slowly in $25 increments. The crowd was dead silent, watching the drama unfold. We passed 900, then 950. It was a fortune, but it was a fraction of what the land was truly worth. It was a once-in-a-generation opportunity born from a tragedy. At $975 an acre, the other bidder shook his head and stepped back. "Sold!" the auctioneer shouted, his gavel coming down with a sharp crack. "To Tom Miller for $975 an acre!" A murmur went through the crowd. It wasn't a murmur of jealousy or scorn. It was something different. It was respect. In the middle of the worst agricultural crisis since the Great Depression, while empires of debt were crumbling into dust. My father's quiet, cautious philosophy had not only allowed me to survive, but to grow. I hadn't used the bank's money. I had used my own. After I signed the papers with the banker, a man who now looked at me with a newfound appreciation, I found Dave. He was sitting in his wife's parents' car, parked down the road, watching the last of his life be carried away. I walked up and tapped on the window. He rolled it down. "I heard what you did," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's good land, Dave," I said simply. "I'm going to be working at the tire shop in town," he said, staring straight ahead. "Fixing flats, after all this." He finally turned to look at me. "If you ever need a hired hand during harvest, someone who knows how to run a combine, His voice trailed off. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. And I meant it. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The 1980s were tough for everyone, but we made it. I farmed my original 320 and the new 480, my land now bordering the creek on both sides. I did it with my father's 4020, the old Farm All M, and the Gleaner E. The work was harder, the days longer, but I was my own man. I owed nothing to anyone but the memory of my father. The nickname the community had given me, Old Man Miller II, stuck. But its meaning had changed. It was no longer an insult. It was a badge of honor. When younger farmers were looking at buying a piece of equipment, they'd stop by my shop. "What do you think of this, Tom?" they'd ask. "Is it built to last?" When the bankers tried to push a new loan on them, they'd say, "I think I'll run it by Tom Miller first." I had become, in a strange way, the conscience of the county, a living reminder that the race isn't always to the swift, but sometimes to the steady. Years later, in the early 90s, I was in my shop on a crisp autumn afternoon. The harvest was done, the grain was in the bin, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. My own son, Daniel, named after his grandfather, was 12 years old. He was standing on a stool next to the 4020, his small hands trying to grip a large wrench. I was showing him how to adjust the valve lash, just as my father had shown me. "Why don't we just get a new tractor, Dad?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Jason's dad has one with a computer in it." I stopped what I was doing and wiped my greasy hands on a red rag. I looked at the old John Deere, its green paint faded and chipped, its tires worn smooth in places. I thought of all the hours I had spent in its seat, the seasons it had seen, the storms it had weathered. I thought of my father, and I thought of Dave. "This tractor," I said, placing my hand on the warm engine block, "doesn't have a computer, but it has something more important. It has a history, and it has a title." Daniel looked at me, confused. "A title?" "That's right," I said, kneeling down to look him in the eye. "It means we own it, free and clear. Just like we own this land. It's ours. No banker can ever come and take it away. In the good years, it works for us. In the bad years, it doesn't work against us. It just waits. It endures." I handed him the wrench. "Your grandfather taught me that the most valuable thing a man can have isn't the newest, or the biggest, or the fanciest. It's the thing he doesn't owe any money on. Now, let's get this valve set just right. She's got a lot of seasons left in her yet." He nodded, a look of understanding dawning on his young face. He placed the wrench on the adjusting nut, and together we turned it. In the quiet of the machine shed, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future, the legacy was passed on. Not a legacy of acres or dollars, but of wisdom, of resilience, and of a quiet, unshakable freedom that was worth more than all the new tractors in the world.